with our new supplemental show that you and I have taken to doing. Each week, David Hawkins is appearing with me on Fridays, of course, in our show that is presented both here on YouTube and Patreon, Periscope, all of the channels we normally appear on. And I apologize, David. Whenever I return from out of town, there's a rebuilding of the studio that takes place that always has me in a bit of a fluster. And today we're going to be talking about something really so interesting. I had the opportunity, as many people saw, to speak with U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, and you had a really wonderful quote about the conversation Secretary Ross and I had. I believe you said it was the most important question not answered by a dog that didn't bark, or something like that.
Never answered by a non-barking dog. There were so many negatives there, I'm not quite sure what I meant, but I think the listeners will probably understand.
Yes, indeed. Well, it's lovely to see you, David. I hope you're having a nice Boxing Day, is it, today?
Yes, Boxing Day, that's when you take the presents back and you try and exchange them for something useful, right?
I never really knew what Boxing Day was. I think it's a British thing, if I'm not mistaken. Most of the time, if people are boxing in the United States, it would be, I guess, pugilism in the UK. And I apologize, I'm wearing a sloppy t-shirt, David. I had intended to be, I'm like, what's his name? Mr. Rogers, put on a sweater and zip up and make myself presentable. The thing that I've been spending a large amount of time on today, David, is trying to find an alternative to Patreon. You and I have created really, I think, a great thing doing our shows each week on patreon.com/crowdsource the truth, as well as patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards. But there's been a terrible dust up with Patreon lately, and I'm really conflicted over what to do, because I object tremendously to their abuse of the First Amendment rights of people who want to use potentially objectionable language. I think it's important that everybody remembers that hate speech is in fact protected. Free speech. If people don't like it, they're free to tune out. But we can't just shut down words that people dislike, because then who decides what is a dislikable word? So what I've been working on this morning, David, and through the afternoon, is trying to set up an account with Amazon Prime so that people who are subscribed to that video service can see some of the programming from Crowdsource the Truth, as well as some of the other things that are out there. There's something called Podia. It's amazing the lack of options that we have for monetizing content.
Well, you know, that's absolutely right. And the point is, the tragedy is, as we get closer to the truth, whatever system we choose as a vehicle to monetize what we're doing, it's going to be followed by organizations, for example, that have custody of the Kinetic North America patent, which is social engineering protection appliance. So I'm not sure there's a way out. And I've been thinking, and the beauty of yours and my relationship, which is developing, is that we can think on the fly. And maybe I could just float an idea in front of you and your audience, or our audience,
Sure.
That relates to your collage, which is a wonderful collage today. You can see that you've got this helmet with 343 in red, Fire Department of New York. Beside it is a Motorola radio system. There's a picture of me above. That's kind of incidental. There's a picture of a satellite that could probably be one of the Maxar satellites. Maxar used to be called McDonald, Dettweiner and Associates, headquartered in Richmond in British Columbia. I met John McDonald in 1995 because I wanted to see if he had any interest in selling his company to the company that I introduced artificial intelligence to in the United Kingdom, which was an outfit called Rakel Defense. Anyway, he didn't look me in the eye. The company was sold to Orbital Sciences of Dulles, Virginia in 1995. It was taken back by a group of pension funds and a private equity group in December of 1999, and on May the 3rd of 2001, it announced it had been awarded a contract by the United States Air Force for instrument approach procedures, which would allow the user of a drag and drop interface to take a plane off its regular en route airway and fly it around various obstacles to a safe landing. And if you look at that May the 3rd announcement, they were planning to sell it to 108 United States Air Force bases around the world. Effectively, what they did with that press release is, I believe, they announced that they were ready to attack America through ownership or custody or control of McDonnell Detweiler Technologies, now Maxar. But let me just go on, if I may, to this funding model. You and I now, to a greater or lesser extent, depend on income through Patreon, and I'd like to make a Christmas greeting to everyone who's subscribed to my show, and for that matter, subscribe to your show, because we have developed, I think, something unique, and we can continue to develop it with something unique, with a deliverable at the end of each week, and this is my proposal, where we effectively on the show outline a potential class action lawsuit for injured communities. In this particular case, the community is injured by the appalling death of 343 members of the Fire Department of New York, where the waves, bless them, has met above their heads. Now, would it be interesting perhaps for your listeners and my listeners to know that the debris and body bits of those firefighters are underneath Garbage Hills 1 and 9 on the Fresh Kills landfill in New York, and there's a sign, maybe you'll be able to find it, a little girl whose father it was, she says, "My dad is not garbage."
Wow.
Which tears me up a bit, because these scumbags, and I'm going to come to Wilbur Ross in a minute, I believe conspired to remove evidence, forensic evidence, that would have been required to work out the temperature of the explosives or incendiaries which killed those firefighters just by looking at an enamel of their teeth. Over to you.
I'm looking for that image of a little girl holding a sign about fresh kills. I was aware that some of this material was moved over there to Staten Island, but can't find that sign immediately. Of course, there is a tribute to the New York City firefighters, a statue that was made sometime after the event. I don't know if you've seen this, David, but this is somewhere in the 40s, and it's not outside a firehouse. I'm not sure how they selected where to put this. The Kneeling Fireman, it's called. But
sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so just to stay with that notion of the funding model and plan B, if you will, because we can't rely on Patreon to be around when it is wittingly or unwittingly, willingly or unwillingly, sending out stories where people genuinely try and dig behind the curtain to discover the truth, such as you and I. And so it's a form of censorship, which is really difficult to fight when you don't know what pressure or forces are being placed on the owners and operators of Patreon. So true. I've got an idea that what you and I do, or could be doing every week, is developing a description through Discovery CSI, which I've trademarked because I think that's what I bring with my experience and knowledge of the Patent Office to any talk show host, but in particular you, Jason, because you are superb at collaging the essence of the ideas and bringing up images which help the audience move through what can be an extraordinarily technical challenge, which is not so much the crime, how the crime is executed, but how the crime scene investigation is sabotaged by people like Robert Mueller. And that's a lot subtle, because effectively what I'm saying is they control the outcome of the crime scene investigation to make sure that it doesn't bring the listener or the layperson looking at this closer to the truth, to the real perpetrators. And one of the techniques they use, with which I'm deeply familiar and I've been working on it since 1981, is they use artificial intelligence or fuzzy logic or expert system algorithms to work out what rewards can be paid or shared with what I call Con Air SWAT teams, special weapons and tactics teams, when they take out a high-value target or neutralize the carbon footprint at a mass casualty event. Now, that might sound like gobbledygook, but maybe Americans, because it's in their backyard, literally, should take a look at that 3D laser-developed image of Ground Zero that you found, or we've found, because that image, yeah, that's right. Amazingly enough, it was attached to the publicity about the 10 millionth patent that was granted to Raytheon and signed off, as I understand it, by none other than United States President Donald Trump and his Commerce Secretary, Wilbur Ross. Now, I think I made rather a rude remark. You were at that conference, and there was tremendous applause when Wilbur Ross announced that the 10 millionth patent had been signed, so there was a lot of applause around it. And I said to you, it looks like to me like turkeys applauding Christmas.
Yeah.
Because, I'm appalled at, well, frankly, I'm totally disappointed. And there are clues on that desk to something that's very sinister taking place. As you know, it's so easy to get diverted down the rabbit holes, but I'll come to it in a minute. That those phone terminals on the desk of the President of the United States, they replaced a previous phone terminal called an IST-2 that was a terminal for the President's use for the red switch, the defense red switch network. And it gone, and it went during the Obama era in, I think, 2009. And effectively what it meant is the operator of the IST-2 had decided to take it away from the president and deny him the ability to have a flash override facility that would link him to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the 4 commanders of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps, which would have been kind of useful during the 9/11 attack. But what they'd done brilliantly is they'd moved George Bush into an elementary school in Florida where he was detached from his communications network. They put Dick Cheney down in the Presidential Emergency Operating Center, sandwiched between, and I'm not allowed to make my facetious remark, but I'm glad that some people have caught on because I don't want to be accused of anything, between 2 ladies, Condoleezza Rice and Lynn Cheney, and he's looking very nervous, and I think I would too. But that's kind of by the by. But there it is. There's the Red Switch Network, IST-2. It's been removed from the presidential Oval Office and substituted with an Alcatel-Lucent phone, which I believe is not secure, meaning there's a hack or a tap of everything Donald Trump does, including announcing or parading the 10 millionth patent.
Wow. Who could do that, David? Change the president's phone? I mean, who has the authority to, and how do we know this isn't some updated, version of the same thing?
Well, there are other pictures that show you the front of this, and the Alcatel-Lucent phone is a very different phone and has a very different purpose from the IST-2, the Defense Red Switch Network. And I suggest to you, and you can Google for it, that the operator of the Defense Red Switch Network is no longer in the hands of the United States, but it's operated by Serco. Over to you.
Wow. So the Defense Switch Red Network?
The Defense Red Switch Network.
Defense Red Switch Network. It's interesting. My former associate, Quinn Michaels, used to speak about something he called the Red Network, but this is a little bit slightly different. So the thing that I wanted to just bring to everyone's attention that's kind of interesting, right here on the website for Telcor, the description of this IST-2 telephone, which appears to have some kind of official seal or some kind of, you know, I don't know if you can see this on the screen share, David, but there's this little button here or whatever that is. It says the IST2 is a 50-line button desk wall-mounted telephone instrument that serves as the user interface to Raytheon digital switching systems. The IST2 provides the user with a consolidated secure/non-secure communications device, which seems oxymoronic, allowing access to all of the switch resources from a single instrument. This eliminates the need for the user to have to remember particular operational nuances of a communications device. That sounds like Hillary Clinton would love it. She can, you know, avoid security in favor of convenience.
Well, interesting you should say that. And again, stop me if I go down too many rabbit holes, but on Christmas Eve for various Christmas night, yesterday, I had some time on my hands and I went to see this movie called The Favorite, right? Which is a fascinating movie from a psychodramatic point of view, whether that's the correct term, that relates to Queen Anne in the 18th century, Marlborough, the Duke of Marlborough, who's tackling the French, and a couple of lesbian favorites of Queen Anne. And this was researched and written by a history student or graduate. I don't know where she graduated from. But it talks about the dynamics of, how shall I put it, corrupt, is that the right word? Well, I guess, sexual triangle around the party that can authorize going to war or pulling troops away and suing for peace. And I thought, wouldn't that be interesting if there was a dynamic like that in Washington, where you have a President Trump surrounded by a variety of people, including the associates of DOJ Pride, which, as you know, is an organization that fascinates me, because that represents the LGBT community within the FBI, the Bureau of Prisons, the United States Marshal Service, Office of Justice Program, DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency, and alcohol, tobacco, and firearm and explosives. And what I propose, and I believe that you and I can develop this argument, is to demonstrate to America that the outcome of any crime scene investigation of significance, like the anthrax attacks after 9/11, or the murder of little John Benet Ramsey on Christmas Day of 1996, where there's evidence of a script having been written before the dirty deed is done, and where there is evidence of spoliation at the crime scene, including the withholding of evidence, then you've got an opportunity for a class action lawsuit for wrongful death, but you will never have a successful opportunity to bring a court case in the criminal courts to prove murder one, because this octopus, if you'd like to call it, has its tendrils wrapped around the Department of Justice, administered through, and again, it's the sexual orientation of people within the FBI and the United States Marshal Service and the Bureau of Prisons, should have nothing to do with the outcome of the crime scene investigation. I think you'd agree with that, right?
Yeah, of course not. There's an interesting book written by Charlie Robinson, who's been a guest on the show, David, called The Octopus of Global Control. I don't know if you're familiar with that book, but you might find it quite interesting. The other thing I wanted to bring to your attention, David, that movie, The Favorite, I hadn't heard of that, so maybe people will go see that. I know most of our viewers are wondering how many legs may have been had by somebody. Yeah.
Don't you think he looks nervous?
Well, the reason I wanted to show this picture of Dick Cheney in the Situation Room, or wherever this is, between Lynn Cheney and Condoleezza Rice, it's very interesting, the body language of Mr. and Mrs. Cheney covering their mouths, both with their, I guess that would be their left hands. And I think that most body language experts would say that the act of covering one's mouth is the subconscious suppression of a lie. Even if you observe someone else telling a lie, there's a tendency to cover the mouth. So I wonder if Dick and Lynn Cheney know something that they don't want us to know.
Very good point. And well, I tell you what I think Lynn Cheney knows. She knew that together with Norman Mineta, the Transportation Secretary, on 9/11, she'd signed off of the bonus check for John Benet Ramsey's father of $118,000, right? And that was the money requested in the ransom note, where the FBI didn't do its job. For example, when you take a child, or when there is a belief that a child of, I think the words are tender age,
right,
is taken in a kidnap, the probability is that child or should be suspected of being taken across a state border. And the FBI is supposed to have been called immediately. Well, it wasn't. You have Detective Arndt, and she of the googly eyes, you know, the ones like that,
yes.
Looked like she's been hit in the back of the neck with a stunned mullet, right? This woman, she sat around the house begging for help from someone, right? Boulder police, I guess. And eventually she told John Benet Ramsey's father, John Bennett Ramsey, to take another look. And lo and behold, and I think they'd been sitting in the house for about 4 or 5 hours, he goes down into the basement, pushes open the door, and he finds his daughter's body there, right? Now, 118,000, as we've discussed, is a very odd sum, but I mustn't get too buried in the detail because I want to come back to the 343 dead firefighters and what you and I can do with our listeners and the appropriate, or whatever is considered to be appropriate, financial support. Put it in a nutshell, I would like to see both yours and my subscribers go up by an order of magnitude, a factor of 10, as quickly as possible, because let's say Patreon does pull the plug on the kind of show that you and I do. If we by then have got, let's say, X thousand people who understand what we're trying to do, which is to lay out a case for wrongful death by injured communities, where you and I can explore the probability of putting together different patented devices that would leave a very characteristic signature at a crime scene that helps explain, A, the degree of scripting and synchronicity as you go into the crime scene, and B, the outcome of the crime scene investigation being sabotaged. That is, I'm talking about spoliation, or the injection of fake news or media plays, or the operation of the social engineering protection appliance by Kinetic, if that makes sense. And that would insulate us and our audience, because then for this week we might do 343 dead firefighters and investigate that. And we can do it in what I call the court of public opinion, which I think is your show, Jason. I mean, well, people can call it. Go ahead.
Well, no. I was just agreeing. I think we do have the court of public opinion here available to us. And, you know, it's interesting, David, because when I first started the Patreon account, I was just sort of saying, hey, if you like the show, sign up on Patreon. But then Patreon became a more useful and necessary tool after Crowdsource the Truth was attacked with malicious complaints. You know, people who were putting in complaints on YouTube against the YouTube channel in an effort to try to completely take the YouTube channel out. So what I did was I started a Vimeo account, and I started the patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth page, and also the pages of each of my guests, including patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, receive this Vimeo feed for each show that we do, and it had a lot of advantages. It allowed my guests to earn money from their appearances on the show. It allowed me to avoid this really draconian policy of any anonymous user or even thousands of anonymous fake accounts putting in complaints. You know, when someone mentioned a specific something or other, it created an opportunity for those that wanted to stop us from pursuing the truth to put in complaints. And as everyone has seen, the 2 fraudulent lawsuits that have been brought against me are not succeeding in court because they have no basis in fact. Like all of the allegations that have been made against me, they're pure smears. So it was troubling for me to see Patreon sort of join this chorus of tech companies that bend to the will of the social justice warriors, or perhaps the left-leaning companies that are among those seen on the Federal Bridge. So I'm trying to diversify us. People can still support you and I on patreon.com. But I think really, David, the only option that we have is to get to as many platforms as possible. Some people here in the comments seem pleased to see that Amazon Prime might be a choice. Not that Amazon would be avoiding the tech giants, but I mean, this is the problem. We need to deal in credit cards and we need to use the internet. So it seems that there may always be some degree of control.
Well, you know, you're absolutely right. And I think, let's say we found another organization that could substitute for Patreon, the same logic would apply to them because, and let me come back to Wilbur Ross and that interview you had, where effectively, if I remember correctly, he said the United States Patent and Trademark Office manages itself. And you pointed out that Serco had just claimed it had processed the 4 millionth patent for the United States Patent and Trademark Office. Well, either Wilbur Ross is a fool, and I'm looking at his body language there, and I think he's sort of choking over his water very happily. Well, maybe he's not. Maybe he's getting a little late in the tooth, and we can all get, you know. It does seem to me, though, that a guy who's claiming credit or for presiding over, because Commerce Secretary has the United States Patent and Trademark Office in its bailiwick, he's claiming that what a wonderful job they've done processing 10 million patents, and he seems, if I'm kind of pessimistic, to have forgotten the fact that Serco's done 4 million of them and announced that on the 15th of November last month. Right? So I think he knows that Serco is acting as a processor, and I'm saying, well, Serco, what I call the Serco Patented Imperial Trust and its associates and agents have custody of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. That relationship goes back to World War II, when Serco was called RCAGB, 1929, and RCA, Radio Corporation of America, was given production rights in the proximity fuse in 1940 and used it to great effect to make a great deal of money in World War II. So we're dealing with an amazing historical lineage, I suggest, of corruption and treason in the United States Patent and Trademark Office. And I would suggest that Trump gets Serco out of every major contract with the United States, including, and this makes my head shake, is the operation of the United States National Visa Center since 1994.
Yeah. Which
means to say Serco is responsible for bringing Al-Qaeda sleeper cells into the United States after the failed attack of 1993, where they were trying to blow up Tower 1 and knock it into Tower 2. And the man allegedly responsible for that, I think there was a blind sheikh. I always think it's pretty hilarious if you've got to default to a blind sheikh as a master organizer of the attack of 1993. But they managed to get Ramzi Youssef and put him in ADX Florence in a little, what I call a pod of criminality, which is you had Ted Kaczynski on one side and, what's his name, O'Neill on the other side, and courtesy of Christine Marcy, Field McConnell's sister, who was a senior counsel for the United States Detention and Naturalization Service. Yeah, look at him. Isn't he a great guy?
Well, the reason I wanted to show this, David, is that I always thought that this blind sheikh from, I think he was from Jersey City or Newark or something, he looks like the evil Santa Claus. Look at his hat and his beard.
Well, he's a Hollywood, yes, he was a Hollywood character. That's why it's so amusing to see these fiction characters, you know, or let's call it, I don't know, the James Bond and the Spectre. I think there's many good script writers and people within Hollywood who are desperately trying to get the truth out without getting killed, right? So they create these far-fetched characters, hoping that someone, perhaps you and I, will trawl around Wikipedia. And I think I talked to you about this FBI, is it the Counterintelligence Division? Okay, no, the Counterterrorism Division. In the Wikipedia entry, for the moment, it has, organization is responsible for breeding terrorists in the United States.
Right.
Right? So, well, how do you explain? That's like, to me, it's like the Mendenhalling of Christine Marcy.
I want to find that exact, it's the Counterterrorism Wikipedia?
Yes, Counterintelligence
Counterterrorism
Center,
Unit.
I think it is. Terrorism, CTD, perhaps.
Yes, Counterterrorism Division. Here it is.
And it's the Wikipedia entry. And what would be very interesting, maybe someone could get a screenshot of it. Sooner or later, I expect the claim that this organization was breeding terrorist groups to be removed from Wikipedia, and something. Oh, yeah, for the moment, it's still in.
Right. So now, this is particularly interesting, David.
That's jaw-dropping.
It is. Let's read it aloud. The Counterterrorism Division, and this is FBI counterterrorism from Wikipedia. We know Wikipedia can remove anything they find objectionable, so it's surprising to see something like this here. It says the Counterterrorism Division is a division of the National Security Branch of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The Counterterrorism Division breeds terrorist threats inside the United States, provides information on terrorists outside the country, and tracks known terrorists worldwide. In the wake of the September 11th, 2001 attacks, Counterterrorism Division's funding and manpower have significantly increased. Now, I want to focus on this for a minute, David, because this crosses over into a lot of the topics that you and I discuss. They're saying right here that it breeds terrorist threats. And in the same paragraph, it reminds us that the funding has increased significantly. And it causes me to think of conversations I've had with people like Bill Binney, in which Bill has said that he feels the most significant threat to the FBI, the NSA, these other agencies, the most significant threat to them carrying out their job is the use of outside contractors. So when I see something in Wikipedia that tells us that the funding and the manpower has increased significantly, that causes me to presume that there are probably contractors vying for some of that funding. Now, you've spoken to us quite a bit about the social engineering protection appliance, and that's from Connecticut, from Kinetic. And I wanted to also talk about the State Department GEC, which is the Global Engagement Center. Have we spoken about that very much, David?
No.
It's interesting because, I don't know how this fits into some of these other things, but the State Department's Global Engagement Center, as I understand it, let's read it right here from the State Department's webpage. The Secretary of State established the Global Engagement Center in April 2016, pursuant to Executive Order 13721, and the GEC was subsequently codified into law by Congress in the fiscal year of 2017. The National Defense Authorization Act, which defined its mission as being to lead, synchronize, and coordinate efforts of the federal government to recognize, understand, and expose and counter foreign state and non-state propaganda and disinformation efforts aimed at undermining the United States national security interests. Now, of course, David, the NDAA is the same act that brought about the Smith modernization, making the use of propaganda against American citizens legal. So this causes me to wonder, is this Global Engagement Center and its dedication to fighting foreign propaganda, does this present some sort of a need for some of these people that we've encountered to really, you're in Canada, You're a British citizen, so anything that you say that would be deemed propaganda could be classified as foreign propaganda. I'm an American citizen. My only affiliation is to the United States, but there are so many people that have worked so hard to spread misinformation and disinformation, trying to link me to other countries, agencies, etc. I wonder if it's not so that they can pursue funds from things like this Global Engagement Center.
Well, I mean, we're touching on many, many issues here. What I like to do is identify Wilbur Ross's role in all this. It's quite important, I think, ultimately to attach it to a human being, because some of these abstracts, you know, like Global Engagement Center, I mean, it's gobbledygook. It's from a management point of view. What the hell is a Global Engagement Center? You might as well be engaging terrorists. After all, you're breeding them, right? Hillary Clinton has a phone system that's been backdoored to every hostile force in the world. Her husband sends John Shalikashvili to China in 1997 to transfer all of America's weapons secrets to the communist Chinese. So I would say that the intelligence agencies of the United States are now completely compromised, but who or what is compromising them? Well, I'm very certain now that the Department of Justice Pride organization has a key role in ensuring that the outcome of crime scene investigations into high-value targets, which range all the way to JFK, and amazingly enough, in my opinion, I think, to little John Benet Ramsey, who in many ways I think may have been more strategic to the survival of the United States than even the loss of JFK. But I digress. The point is, when you go into a crime scene investigation, there are more clues that are laid out in the failure of the crime scene investigation than there are in the investigation of the crime itself. So, for example, when we talk about Kinetic North America was given the contract to operate MOD Boscombe Down, which is the airfield near the Portendown Research Center into biological and chemical weapons, such as anthrax and Novichok. So now we have to ask ourselves, when Robert Mueller was looking over the investigation into what was known as Amerithrax, which is America and Anthrax attack, why did he, as I understand it, he pulled the team, the FBI team that was going to fly to, presumably Boscombe Down, and determine whether or if a scientist at Boscombe Down had smuggled out the anthrax, the Ames bacteria, and then weaponized it with sabotage spore powder for use in the attacks on Senate and media leaders in the United States after 9/11. Another question to ask is, what was the purpose of that anthrax attack? Because there's a very big discrepancy between a guy, as I often say, straddling a yak in a cave in Afghanistan, putting on an attack of the scale. And maybe you could just pop in that picture of the Raytheon 3D multispectral laser picture of what the World Trade Center complex might have looked like. Now, we're supposed to believe that this yak-straddling guy with the beard in the cave in Afghanistan is supposed to have organized the pilots, some of whom could barely fly Cessnas horizontally, into wreaking that level of damage in New York. Now, if you look at that, there's something very interesting that maybe I can challenge you a little bit to see if it reminds you. You see where World 1 and 2 Trade Center towers have collapsed into that crater in the sort of the center of the picture. Then there's a line of buildings that are untouched, right?
Yeah.
And then there's a building that's been flattened in a way almost identical to the way 1 and 2 came down. That's building number 7. Right? You can see that? What does that remind you of in recent memory?
Well,
that split between those
the fires.
Obviously, exactly. In California, remember? The Cal Fire, where in the Paradise, the picture by, is it, I think, Digital Globe, which is one of the arms of Maxar Technologies, which was called McDonnell Depminer. You've got buildings that have been zapped, literally, and some buildings are untouched. And between some of those buildings, you've got trees that are still green.
Right.
Right. So what they're able to do, I believe, is to be very selective and identify the buildings and the people inside them, because the people who've gone inside, like the 343 firefighters, have been sent into an ambush. Right? Now, with the algorithms I talked about earlier, in real time, they could be calculating the weight of carbon saved by killing the firefighters in that building and dropping the building. And you could actually be betting on the outcome of the attack, the overall attack, in the total carbon saved by destroying, basically downtown New York and killing 343 firefighters. And that brings me back to Wilbur Ross, because Wilbur Ross, as a senior executive with N.M. Rothschild and Sons for 25 years, N.M. Rothschild is the investment banker for Donald Trump.
And that's something I didn't even get to
Queen
ask
Elizabeth
him.
II,
Right.
and Serco and Kinetic. Over to you.
Now, so talk to me a bit more. Let's discuss now, in the wake of my conversation with Wilbur Ross, what was he was an investment banker for Serco?
No, he's working as an investment banker with N.M. Rothschild and Sons, that was incorporated in the City of London in 1811. Is the fifth oldest bank in the United Kingdom. Victor Rothschild was briefly the chairman of N.M. Rothschild and Sons Limited. And if you remember, Victor Rothschild is probably the man responsible for the transfer of technology in the Tizard mission to the United States. Right? He was Churchill's right-hand man. He was a very capable biologist and a chemist. He would have known all about things like Novichok and anthrax and that sort of thing. Apparently, he was a major figure in the administration of Porton Down. He died in 1990, right? And so he would have been a very useful guy for the Japanese for the attack on Pearl Harbor, because he would have had access to technology like the cavity magnetron and the proximity fuse. Now, when he was in the United Kingdom, apparently he visited the professor at Birmingham University who had invented the cavity magnetron, and he literally took the cavity magnetron, or the prototype, away for 3 or 4 days, and then he returned it with a little note, "You've got to be more careful with security." Now, Victor Rothschild, many people believe he was the fifth man of the Cambridge spy ring. Now, what's to prevent him from transferring that technology that was absolutely fundamental, actually, to the outcome of the war, to the Japanese to aid and abet the attack on Pearl Harbor? And what essentially I'm saying is, for me, the MO of Pearl Harbor is identical to the MO of 9/11. And the Brits played a major role in both. Over to you.
Wow. I'm looking here, David, at Serco's webpage, and they've got a section where they talk about company advisors, and N.M. Rothschild is listed right there. So I presume when you say the Wilbur Ross interview is the most important question not answered by a dog that didn't bark, that Mr. Ross himself is the dog, and his not barking is, he didn't say, "What do you mean? What is Serco and how do they control the patent office?" He just said, "I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about space."
No, well, actually, he didn't. He said, what did he say? I think, "I'm not here to talk about Serco."
Yeah.
Didn't he say that?
Something like that. He said he's here to talk about space because space is the next trillion-dollar industry. And of course, who is a huge manufacturer of aerospace technology, but Raytheon, same guys that make that phone. But it's interesting. I mean, it's not like there's no connection between N.M. Rothschild and Sons Limited and Serco. They're listed right here as a company advisor. So that would seem to be a pretty close connection. What do you think about that?
Well, so I've coined this phrase "spit" because it's got nice connotations. Serco patented Imperial Trust, right? Because, we've discussed the Imperial Brain, which I think was the general instrument, the instrument room of the General Post Office in the 1840s, where there was a huge number of young women who were translating or transcribing the incoming telegram signals, cable telegram from around the empire. And of course, if you had access to information about whether there was a drought in Australia and the sheep were all dying and the price of wool was going to go up or down, if you could get that to your investors at the London Stock Exchange or Commodity Exchange, you would make them very wealthy. So somehow or other, Rothschild got into position where basically it controlled, I would say, the fastest forms of communication that would give insiders the opportunity to make a great deal of money, right the way through to the 9/11 attack, where if you knew the attacks were coming and which buildings were targeted, and you had access to the Serco-patented Imperial Trust, the members of that trust, Jason, as I mentioned earlier, they met on the 47th floor of the North Tower on the morning of 9/11. And all of them, as far as we know, escaped. Christopher Hyman, the chief executive officer of Serco, had gone, and maybe that would be for next week, we talk about the dead associated with the Risk Waters breakfast meeting in the Windows of the World restaurant on the morning of 9/11, where Christopher Hyman attended. But he left at around 8:30 in the morning of 9/11, and he went down to the 47th floor to address a meeting of shareholders. And the shareholders of Serco, and what the hell is Robert Mueller not? Robert Mueller should have hauled in the FBI, all of the shareholders of Serco who met on the 47th floor, and asked them, what the hell were you doing there? I think they were forcing the securities which they held under the umbrella of global custodians to buy carbon offsets to neutralize the carbon footprint of companies like Raytheon, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and Lockheed Martin, over on the top right of your image there, the Federal Bridge.
Right.
So what do you do if you're the chairman of Lockheed Martin or the chairman of Boeing? Your shares are held by these global custodians representing major pension funds like the New York City Employees Retirement System. And here's one way, I suggest, of silencing the fire department of New York, because you could tell them, well, your pension fund is handled through a global custodian. It's now State Street. It was, I think, either Morgan Stanley or JP Morgan, can't remember which. But those custodians on the morning of 9/11 would have been handling the investments for the New York City Employees Retirement System in companies like Serco or Boeing. So you can see the moral dilemma of a firefighter. He's lost, or she has lost, 343 of their colleagues in this extraordinary attack, where somehow their radios are jammed so they don't get the signal to evacuate. Meanwhile, the bad guys have access to Motorola radios, and maybe you could pop up that link to the encrypted patent that Motorola has, where the bad guys are equipped with perfect communications during the attack, and the good guys having their communications jammed, so they lose 343 people. Right?
Yeah,
so
I think this is it. What were they here?
What were they discussing on the 47th floor on the morning of 9/11 after Christopher Hyman came down from the Risk Waters breakfast meeting in the Windows of the World, and everyone that he left behind died? So there's potentially a whole bunch of expert witnesses who are never going to be witnesses in court. And what I'm saying is, with a little help from our fans, if you will, because it would be nice to have a fan base for what we're trying to do, with a little help from our fans, we can help avenge those firefighters by showing the families how to bring a class action suit in the court of public opinion, a bit like Erin Brockovich, who I admire greatly. Over to you.
Well, David, you know, this carbon credits thing is something that, it's one of those things that everybody's sort of aware of, but maybe we don't think very much about. And, you know, we've started talking about it recently. You are the one person I'm aware of who has brought some clarity and some scientific explanation to the inflammatory statement that climate change is a hoax. And I mean, sort of saying something like that and then nothing else, it's a bit like the verbal equivalent of an elevator fart, where you sort of just leave it and it's like, whoa, what is that? You know, it doesn't really go anywhere, but when you dig into it.
I have no experience of that, but I don't know what you're talking.
Well, but I was looking into this Chicago Climate Exchange a bit, and it's a company. It's it's who has carbon, who has access to this. It was created by this guy Richard Sandor, who I'm not really familiar with, but the founders are Al Gore and Richard Sandor. So when you learn that the Chicago Climate Exchange is a company, and we see that Al Gore was behind the creation of it, it starts to make me wonder what the true motivation of things like this movie An Inconvenient Truth might be. They want to convince everyone that these carbon credits are something that they need to buy, and they want to give some value to their Chicago Climate Exchange. According to Wikipedia, it was North America's only voluntary, legally binding greenhouse gas reduction and trading system for emission sources and offset projects in North America and Brazil. So this seems pretty interesting, David, because it seems like someone has a financial interest in convincing you that carbon dioxide, which, as you've pointed out, is an odorless, invisible, harmless fertilizer gas, these guys want to convince you that you've got to pay money to offset your production of this gas. So it would seem that Richard Sandor and his associates are very interested in convincing people that climate change is real and that carbon emissions are the cause of it.
Yes, and it's scientific nonsense, because the drivers of climate change are totally outside. The principal one is the variations in electromagnetism from the sun. And equinox is every 100,000 years. It somewhat looks like an ellipse that's rotating around the sun. So when you're on the extreme ends of the ellipse, it's a long way from the sun, and the heat that you get from the third power, as you get close to the sun, and we're coming out of what is known, I believe, as an interglacial period of about 1,000 years, where you're close enough for the sun, really, for human beings to go around sometimes in their birthday suits, right? But it's now going to get cooler, and these persuade us that a gas, the anthropogenic component of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is 19 parts per million, which is less than 0.002. Now, that gas is actually, the physical effect is it's a slightly ineffective insulator gas that delays global cooling, but it's not a source of heat or the redistribution of heat. The major cause of climate change, or weather effectively, is the amount of heat received from the sun, the variation in electromagnetic flux, and then the two big currents, the ocean currents. Was it El Nino, and what's the big one? El Nino,
I don't know.
Anyway, whatever. But it's like a hot water bottle. The Earth oceans are huge stores of heat, right? If they're not frozen. And these currents that are floating around affect the climate, but to a lesser extent than the sun. For example, I worked in the Saudi Arabian desert and the Australian desert, and in both places, if it was a clear night, there would be frost on the catwalk of the oil rigs. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, it could be 110 or 120 degrees in the shade, Jason. That's driven by the sun.
Yeah. So, David, would I be going too far to say that Richard Sandor and Al Gore are likely shysters who have invented this carbon climate exchange, the Chicago Climate Exchange, purely for their own profit, to stoke fear in people about something that, we hear all this talk that, climate change is something we can all agree on. It's not politically driven, and obviously the destruction of our home planet or the rendering of it uninhabitable is something that would motivate anyone. Al Gore has been very aggressive in traveling around the world and making these presentations with his film An Inconvenient Truth, which has now proven to be totally inaccurate. None of that stuff that he predicted has come to pass, but yet we're still offered to purchase carbon offset credits when you buy a plane ticket. I mean, it's just a cash grab, really, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. And sitting above Al Gore and Sandor, I believe, is Wilbur Ross, because Wilbur Ross, as you point out, is, Wilbur Ross, when he was working for N.M. Rothschild and Sons, the investment banker for Serco, would have been instrumental, I suggest, in building up this Serco patented Imperial Trust, which has access to the patents of the United Kingdom and the United States and the Five Eyes countries generally, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. And with those patents, you can configure the events or the outcome of a crime scene investigation. First of all, by putting the devices together that allow you to execute the crime. For example, Field McConnell and myself, after a lot of work, decided that the most likely weapons platform to deliver a bunker buster missile into the Pentagon was a Raytheon A3 Sky Warrior, highly modified A3 Sky Warrior, to be able to fly at low elevations and drop an air-to-ground missile which punched a hole through 8 walls of the Pentagon into the inner courtyard. And so, as you know, what I do is I go into the patent office, or at least virtually, and see if I can find a patent to fit the configuration of that hole, and I end up with a Lockheed Martin, rocket-boosted, hardened penetrator bomb. Basically, it's a bunker buster missile that would be able to punch through the 8 holes. So now Wilbur Ross, 25 years with N.M. Rothschild, the banker, the investment banker for Queen Elizabeth II and Donald Trump and Serco and Kinetic, basically would be in a superb position on the morning of 9/11. Why shouldn't the next question you ask Wilbur Ross, if he would like to appear on the show, is, well, Wilbur, what were you doing on the morning of 9/11? Were you hosting a meeting for Serco's patented Imperial Trust members on the 47th floor of the North Tower, and how did you get out unscathed?
I think he's a generally dishonest guy. I was reading some things that said he's been accused of all kinds of shenanigans. Before he was appointed as the Commerce Secretary, he was a banker known for restructuring failed companies in industries such as steel, coal, very polluting, I might add, industries, telecommunications, foreign investment, and textiles. And he specialized in leveraged buyouts and distressed businesses. So that's sort of a predatory business model. I mean, he's not known for inventing things and creating companies based on ideas like somebody like that guy Dyson is known for, making better vacuum cleaners and stuff like that. Wilbur Ross is known for basically being like the financial equivalent of a vulture. So he's the king of bankruptcy because of his record of buying bankrupt companies, primarily in the manufacturing and steel industries. He leaked.
Well, if I may just jump in there, Jason, distressed companies or whatever is really interesting, because you can be in charge of distressing them by breeding terrorist groups, right?
Interesting, yes.
So it's an interesting choice of words. So Wilbur Ross would have been, I think, uniquely positioned with motive, opportunity, and weapon to run or direct the Serco patented Imperial Trust and host the meeting on the 47th floor. Because at that meeting, representatives of Serco shareholders would have been in attendance, and Serco shareholders include the United Kingdom government and its funds, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and its funds, the Singaporean government and its funds, and then 2 big pension funds, that is the Teachers' Pension Fund, which I believe is the biggest private pension fund in the world, with over $1 trillion of assets under management, and its UK equivalent, which is the University Superannuation Scheme, the state of California and its funds, which is kind of interesting,
Yeah, given the PG&E catastrophe bond, that is interesting.
And then 10 global custodian banks, where the global custodians, for example, manage the investments of a pension fund. For example, the British Columbia Investment Management Corporation, which was a co-shareholder in McDonnell Dettweiler, it has $150 billion of assets under management, basically reserved for the benefits of former public or current public employees. And they were a third shareholder in McDonnell Dettweiler when McDonnell Dettweiler made that announcement about being awarded an instrument approach procedures contract by the United States Air Force on May the 3rd, which I'm confident was the technology they used to take the planes off their regular en route airway and fly them through obstacles and nasty-looking towers, except the landing strip, the virtual landing strip for 911 was actually interrupted by Tower 1 and Tower 2 and the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Center. Over to you.
Well, David, we're just about out of time. It seems like you and I could speak endlessly on these topics. And before we close, I just wanted to bring your attention to this statement in the Wikipedia entry about Wilbur Ross. I didn't know this, but it's telling us that in November 2017, leaked documents from the Paradise Papers showed that Wilbur Ross failed to clearly disclose financial ties to Russian interests in his confirmation hearings. Now, this is an explosive revelation. This has been known since November of 2017, and we have seen the most aggressive campaign I can recall against associates of Donald Trump alleging ties to Russians. I find it extremely conspicuous that nothing has been said about these disclosures of Wilbur Ross's financial ties to Russia. That would seem to indicate that the people being singled out, namely Michael Cohen, Dr. Jerome Corsi, Paul Manafort, I would believe they're being targeted for reasons other than legitimate questionable ties to Russia, or else we would see charges and accusations being brought against Mr. Ross. We're going to have to pick up this conversation on Friday, David. I do want to remind everyone that right now, presently, the best way to support David and I is still going to be through patreon.com. People can sponsor David by going to patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, and you can still sponsor Crowdsource the Truth on patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. I am working on a number of alternatives to Patreon, and I will certainly let everybody know about those once they're live and active. David, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you're having a wonderful Boxing Day. I hope you enjoyed Christmas yesterday, and I'll be with you again on Friday.
I look forward to it, Jason. Thank you very much. Bye now.
Thank you, David. I'll see everybody in just an hour when Charles Ortel will be closing in. Tune in, everybody. Thanks for watching.